She was humiliated and forced out of her seat. But just minutes later, the same flight attendant who shamed her was facing consequences. No one could have predicted what happened during this flight. What occurred would change everything, not just for the people on board, but for the entire airline. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. Ava Carter stepped onto the airplane with calm confidence. She wore a tailored blazer over a sleek dress. Her natural curls framed her face. In one hand, she held a leather laptop bag, and in the other, her boarding pass. She walked down the aisle, glancing at the seat numbers as she passed. Ava's demeanor was calm and composed, but there was a quiet determination in her eyes. She seemed like someone who wasn't easily rattled. She reached her assigned seat in the first-class section and smiled politely at the passenger next to her. She placed her bag in the overhead compartment and sat down. Ava pulled out a small notebook and pen. She started jotting down a few notes, her focus entirely on her task. She didn't notice the occasional curious glances from those around her. Moments later, Miranda Scott, one of the flight attendants, walked briskly through the cabin. Miranda wore a crisp uniform and had a sharp gaze. Her eyes landed on Ava and she paused. Something about Ava caught her attention, but Miranda didn't know exactly what. Miranda's expression tightened. She walked closer and stopped just beside Ava's seat. "Excuse me," Miranda said in a polite tone, though it carried an edge. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" Ava looked up, surprised but unfazed. She handed over her boarding pass with a small smile. "Of course." Miranda scanned the ticket and frowned slightly. "This is for first class." "Yes," Ava said, her voice steady. Miranda frowned deeper, as if trying to reconcile something in her mind. After a brief pause, she handed the boarding pass back without a word. Her lips pressed into a tight line as she walked away, though her demeanor suggested she wasn't done yet. Ava shrugged off the interaction and returned to her notes, her pen moving steadily across the paper. She didn't notice Miranda speaking quietly with another flight attendant near the galley, casting glances back in her direction. The tension in Miranda's face was clear, even from afar. It wasn't long before Miranda returned. This time, she had a more authoritative air. "Miss Carter, could you step aside for a moment?" Miranda said. "I need to verify something." Ava blinked in surprise but remained calm. She stood, taking her laptop bag with her. She followed Miranda toward the galley. Passengers in first class exchanged curious looks, whispering among themselves. Ava's poise remained intact. When they reached the galley, Miranda stopped. She folded her arms and spoke with authority. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to a different seat," Miranda said. "It seems there may have been a mistake with your booking." Ava tilted her head slightly. Her brow furrowed in confusion. "A mistake? I don't think so. I booked this ticket weeks ago, and it was confirmed. Could you double-check?" Miranda's tone turned colder. "I already checked. I don't think this seat is appropriate for you. I'll have to ask you to take a seat in the main cabin." The words hung in the air. For the first time, Ava's expression shifted. Disbelief and annoyance crossed her face, but she quickly regained her composure. "I don't understand. My ticket is valid. Why would I need to move?" Miranda stiffened, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I don't have time to explain. Either you move, or I'll have to call security to assist." Ava's eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded once. She quietly returned to her seat to gather her belongings. The entire cabin seemed to be watching now. The murmurs grew louder as Ava walked toward the back of the plane, escorted by Miranda. Ava could feel the stares of other passengers following her. She kept her head high, but her grip on her laptop bag tightened ever so slightly. When they reached the main cabin, Miranda gestured to an empty seat in the middle row. Ava placed her bag under the seat and sat down without a word. Miranda walked away, leaving Ava to settle into her new, cramped seat. Ava looked out the window. Her face was calm, but her thoughts were clearly racing, somewhere between frustration and disbelief. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved swiftly across the screen as she typed a message. When she hit send, a small knowing smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Ava sat quietly in her new seat, her expression unreadable. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, but the tension around her was palpable. A few passengers cast sympathetic glances in her direction, while others quickly averted their eyes, pretending not to notice the awkward situation. Ava ignored them all, her focus entirely on her phone. She scrolled through her contacts and made a quick call, keeping her voice low but firm. "Hello, it's me," she began. "I need a favor. Something happened, and I'd like it addressed immediately. Yes, I'm still on the plane. No need to escalate yet. Just watch for my signal." She ended the call as quickly as she had started it and slipped the phone back into her bag. Her calmness was unnerving, almost as if she knew something no one else did. Back in first class, Miranda moved through her duties with satisfaction. She checked on other passengers, flashing polite smiles and ensuring drinks were served. Yet, her thoughts kept drifting back to Ava. There was something about Ava's composure that unsettled Miranda, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. As far as Miranda was concerned, she had dealt with the situation appropriately. Still, a nagging doubt lingered in the back of her mind. Meanwhile, Ava glanced at the flight attendant assigned to the main cabin, a younger woman named Clara. Unlike Miranda, Clara seemed more empathetic. She approached Ava cautiously, holding a cup of water. "Ma'am, is everything okay?" Clara asked softly, her eyes filled with concern. Ava looked up, her smile warm but brief. "I'm fine, thank you. Just a bit of a mix-up, I suppose." Clara hesitated, clearly sensing there was more to the story, but Ava's composed demeanor discouraged further probing. "Let me know if you need anything," Clara said, placing the water on Ava's tray before stepping away. As the flight continued, Miranda remained unaware of the ripple effect her actions had set into motion. Ava, on the other hand, was entirely in control of the situation. She leaned back in her seat, watching the clouds outside the window. Her fingers tapped rhythmically on her armrest. Her calm exterior concealed the storm brewing beneath the surface. Ava wasn't the kind of person to let something like this slide, but she also wasn't one to lose her temper. She preferred precision over chaos, and she had already set her plan into motion. 7 minutes passed before a voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to thank you for flying with us today. We hope you're enjoying your flight. If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to let one of our crew members know." Ava's eyes flicked toward the front of the plane. Her expression was unreadable as she pulled out her notebook again, jotting down a single line before closing it with a decisive snap. Whatever her next move was, it was clear she was prepared for it. The cabin settled into a quiet rhythm, with passengers engrossed in their books, movies, or quiet conversations. Ava remained still in her seat, her expression calm but with an intensity that hinted at something brewing beneath the surface. Miranda, however, seemed more at ease. She moved through her routine with practiced efficiency. She glanced at the first-class section as she handed out drinks, feeling a small sense of victory. To her, the issue had been resolved, and any discomfort it caused was now in the past. But the past was far from forgotten. Ava leaned slightly forward in her seat and unlocked her phone again. Her fingers hovered over the screen before typing a short cryptic message, "They'll call soon. Let me know when it's done." She hit send. The faint glow of the phone lit up her composed face. The message went unnoticed by surrounding passengers, who were either distracted or disinterested. Ava's lips curved into a subtle smile, but her eyes carried a sharpness that Miranda would have found unsettling if she had noticed. At the front of the plane, Miranda approached the galley and exchanged a few words with another flight attendant, Dennis. Dennis was older and more seasoned, having been with the airline for years. He often acted as a mentor to younger crew members. Miranda leaned in, her voice low. "Did you see that woman earlier?" she asked, glancing subtly in Ava's direction. Dennis raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" "The one I moved to economy," Miranda clarified. "She had a ticket for first class, but something about her didn't sit right with me." She looked out of place. Dennis frowned, leaning against the counter. "Out of place? What do you mean?" Miranda hesitated, realizing she had to tread carefully. "I mean, I had a gut feeling. It's better to be cautious than sorry, right?" Dennis frowned deeper. "A gut feeling doesn't mean you can bump someone without cause. Did she do anything wrong?" "No," Miranda said, cutting him off. Miranda had been warned, but she hadn't realized the full extent of her mistake. She didn't understand just how far-reaching the consequences of her actions could be. If she had, she would have never tried to move Ava. First-class passengers don't take kindly to being moved, And neither does the airline, Dennis had said earlier, and now Miranda could feel the weight of those words pressing down on her. She was about to respond, but before she could say anything, the in-flight phone in the galley buzzed. Dennis picked it up and listened attentively, his face turning from neutral to slightly concerned. "It's for you," he said, handing the phone to Miranda. "They're asking for you by name." Miranda's heart skipped a beat. She hesitated before taking the phone, her fingers tightening around the receiver. "This is Miranda," she said cautiously. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "This is the airline executive office. We've received a direct complaint about an incident involving a first-class passenger. We'll need you to provide a detailed report upon landing. For now, ensure all passengers are treated respectfully and refrain from further altering seating arrangements without proper justification." Miranda's face drained of color as the words sank in. She quickly stammered, "Yes, of course. I'll make sure everything is handled appropriately." As she hung up, her hand trembled slightly. Dennis, watching her closely, didn't say a word, but his expression was unreadable. "What's going on?" he asked after a moment. "Nothing," Miranda muttered, though her nervous edge betrayed her. She glanced toward the main cabin where Ava sat. The calm, composed woman now took on an entirely new meaning. For the first time, Miranda felt a flicker of unease. Ava's stillness seemed like she was aware of something Miranda didn't know. Miranda couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would be out of her control. She tried to focus on her duties, moving through the cabin with robotic precision. But her mind kept drifting back to Ava. Ava, on the other hand, sat quietly, watching the clouds outside the window, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest. She appeared relaxed, even though her mind was entirely focused on what was unfolding. Everything was going according to her plan. Miranda's thoughts were interrupted when Clara, a younger flight attendant, approached Ava with a gentler demeanor. "Excuse me, ma'am," Clara said softly. "Would you like anything to drink? Maybe a snack?" Ava looked up, offering a polite smile. "Just water, please," she replied. Clara nodded and returned moments later with a cup of water and a small napkin. "If there's anything else you need, let me know," she added kindly. Ava's eyes softened with gratitude. "Thank you, Clara," she said, her voice warm. Clara gave a small smile before walking away, leaving Ava to her thoughts. Miranda watched the exchange from afar. It didn't sit well with her. The way Ava interacted with Clara, so poised, so polite, didn't match the narrative Miranda had built in her mind. It bothered her more than she cared to admit. Back in the galley, Miranda's unease grew. Dennis could see it. He leaned closer and asked quietly, "Look, whatever's going on, you'd better hope you didn't mess with the wrong passenger. First class isn't for amateurs." Miranda stiffened at his words but didn't respond. Instead, she busied herself with arranging cups, her mind racing. Who was Ava Carter really? Why did she feel like she had misjudged her? Meanwhile, Ava, still sitting in her seat, slid her phone out of her bag. She glanced at the message that had just arrived. "All set. They're monitoring." Ava put the phone back in her bag, took a sip of water, and settled back in her seat, calm and unhurried. The tension between her and Miranda wasn't lost on a few observant passengers. A man across the aisle leaned over and whispered, "That flight attendant's been giving you a hard time, hasn't she?" Ava met his gaze briefly, her expression neutral. "It's nothing I can't handle," she replied softly. The man raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Ava turned back to the window, her calm demeanor hiding the satisfaction she felt. Everything was moving according to plan. Meanwhile, Miranda's discomfort grew with every passing minute. Every time she glanced toward the main cabin, Ava was as calm and composed as ever. It was unsettling. The unease only deepened when Dennis approached her again in the galley. He handed her a folded note with a glance toward the door. "The captain wants to see you," he said quietly. "Why?" Miranda asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Dennis didn't say anything, just shrugged and gave her a faint disapproving look. "Just go?" Reluctantly, Miranda made her way toward the cockpit. The door shut behind her as she stepped in. Captain Harris, a calm and authoritative man, turned to face her. His co-pilot briefly glanced at her before returning his attention to the controls. "Miranda," Captain Harris began, his tone measured. "We've received another call from the executive office." Miranda's heart sank. She knew what was coming. Sir, she started, but the captain cut her off. This is serious. The passenger you moved, Miss Ava Carter, is not just any passenger. She's connected to the airline's board of directors. We're under direct orders to ensure she's treated with the utmost respect for the remainder of the flight. Miranda's mouth went dry. I didn't know, she stammered. I thought. Did you think, the captain interrupted, his voice firmer now. Or did you assume? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you acted without cause. That's unacceptable. Miranda opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came out. The captain sighed and rubbed his temples. Here's what's going to happen, he said. You'll return to your duties and ensure there are no further incidents. When we land, you'll provide a full report to the ground team. Until then, do not approach Miss Carter unless absolutely necessary. Is that clear? Yes, sir, Miranda whispered, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. The captain nodded toward the door. Dismissed, Miranda left the cockpit, her mind racing. She returned to the galley, where Dennis gave her a questioning look. She ignored him, grabbing a tray of drinks and forcing herself to move through the cabin. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee for a first-class passenger, spilling a few drops onto the tray. She cursed under her breath, quickly wiping it away. Meanwhile, Ava remained undisturbed in the main cabin, her every movement deliberate and measured. As Miranda passed by, Ava glanced up briefly. Their eyes locked for a split second, and Miranda saw something in Ava's gaze, a calmness that was both unsettling and knowing, as if she knew exactly how this would end. Miranda quickened her pace, retreating to the galley once more. For the first time in her career, she felt completely out of control, and she hated it. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. As Miranda returned to the galley, her breathing uneven, Dennis watched her from the corner of his eye. He finished arranging the snack cart and then looked over at her, his voice cautious but curious. Are you going to tell me what's going on? He asked. Miranda hesitated, debating whether to confide in him. Finally, she sighed, her voice low. The woman I moved, she has ties to the board, she murmured. The captain just told me. Dennis straightened, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to alarm. The board? Are you serious? Miranda nodded, her face pale. I had no idea. I don't know what I thought. She just didn't seem like. She stopped herself, realizing how her words sounded. Dennis crossed his arms, his tone sharp. She didn't seem like what? Like someone who belongs in first class. Miranda didn't answer, she couldn't. Instead, she turned away, pretending to busy herself with the inventory. Dennis shook his head, a mix of disbelief and disappointment flashing across his face. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, Ava glanced at her watch again. The flight was nearing its halfway point, but she showed no signs of impatience. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and sent another brief message. Almost time. Sliding the phone back into her bag, she leaned back in her seat, her calm demeanor unshaken. The passengers around her were growing more curious. The man across the aisle who had spoken to her earlier leaned forward slightly and whispered, Are you sure you're okay? That flight attendant looked pretty rattled earlier. Ava smiled faintly, her tone polite but firm. I appreciate your concern, but everything is under control. The man nodded, though he seemed skeptical. Ava's confidence was undeniable, leaving him to wonder if there was more to her than met the eye. At the front of the plane, Miranda tried to regain her composure. She moved through the first-class cabin, checking on passengers. Her smile was forced, brittle, but she couldn't stop her mind from racing. The idea that Ava had connections to the airline's board was bad enough, but the way Ava had handled the entire situation so far made Miranda uneasy. Ava had never raised her voice, never lost her composure. That kind of restraint was rare and powerful. As Miranda returned to the galley to prepare for the next round of service, a chime echoed through the cabin, signaling an incoming announcement. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'd like to thank you for choosing to fly with us today. Our flight is progressing smoothly, and we're on schedule for an on-time arrival. Please continue to enjoy your flight, and as always, don't hesitate to let our crew know if you need anything. The announcement was routine, but Miranda felt every word like a reminder of her growing mistakes. She glanced toward the main cabin again, her eyes landing on Ava. To her surprise, Ava met her gaze briefly, offering a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't smug or confrontational, just a calm, confident acknowledgement. That single gesture sent a shiver down Miranda's spine. Whatever Ava Carter was planning, Miranda was starting to realize she was completely unprepared for it. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as the flight continued, but the tension between Miranda and Ava was impossible to ignore. Miranda tried to focus on her duties, but every action felt mechanical, her mind clouded by unease. She avoided looking toward the main cabin, yet she couldn't help but feel the weight of Ava's presence, as if the calm young woman was silently orchestrating something just out of sight. In the main cabin, Ava remained a picture of composure. She glanced at her watch, then at the small screen in front of her seat, displaying the flight's progress. A faint smile crossed her lips, but it vanished just as quickly. She leaned forward slightly, pulled out her notebook, and began to write again. Her handwriting was neat and deliberate, every word carefully chosen. To an onlooker, it would have seemed like a mundane moment, but for Ava, every detail mattered. Meanwhile, Miranda's discomfort deepened. She returned to the galley and leaned against the counter, her arms crossed tightly. Dennis, who had been observing her for most of the flight, finally decided to speak up. "You've been tense ever since that phone call," he said, his tone low but firm. "What's really going on?" Miranda hesitated, her eyes darting toward the curtain that separated the galley from the main cabin. "I told you already," she muttered. "The passenger I moved has connections, important ones." Dennis raised an eyebrow. "Important enough for the captain to get involved?" "That's not just connections, Miranda, that's a warning." "What did you do to her?" "I didn't do anything," Miranda snapped, though the defensive edge in her voice betrayed her. "She didn't belong in first class, and I—" "You assumed she didn't belong," Dennis interrupted, his voice sharp. "And now you're paying for it. Look, I've been with this airline for years. If you cross someone with real power, you'd better brace yourself. People like that don't let things slide." Miranda clenched her jaw, her frustration bubbling over. What was I supposed to do? She didn't seem like what? Like someone rich enough to sit in first class? Like someone who could afford to fly like the rest of the passengers up there? Miranda fell silent, her hands gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Dennis shook his head, sighing heavily. "You should have left her alone. Now you've made a mess that's way bigger than you realize." As Dennis returned to his duties, Miranda felt a wave of panic wash over her. She knew he was right, but it was too late to undo her actions. She glanced toward the main cabin again, her heart pounding. Ava was still seated calmly, her notebook now closed and tucked away. The faint smile on her face was gone, replaced by an expression of quiet resolve. Just then, a chime echoed through the cabin. Miranda's heart skipped a beat, but it was only the signal for an incoming call to the galley phone. She reached for it, her hands trembling slightly. "Galley, this is Miranda," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "This is the captain," came the voice on the other end. "We've received another communication from the executive office. They've requested that Miss Carter be given full priority service for the remainder of the flight. Make sure she's comfortable and personally apologize for any earlier inconvenience." Miranda's breath caught in her throat. "Yes, sir," she managed to say before hanging up. She stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The request wasn't just a suggestion. It was a direct order, one she couldn't ignore. Summoning what little composure she had left, Miranda prepared herself to approach Ava again. This time, she knew the power dynamic had shifted completely. Whatever happened next, Miranda could feel that her role in the unfolding story was no longer in her control. Miranda stepped out of the galley, clutching a glass of sparkling water on a tray with trembling hands. Her usual poise had vanished, replaced with visible tension as she made her way toward the main cabin. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of her earlier decisions pressing down on her like an anchor. She knew this wasn't just about delivering water. It was an unspoken acknowledgement that she had crossed a line. When she reached Ava's seat, she hesitated, the tray trembling slightly in her grip. Ava looked up, her expression calm and unreadable. The air between them seemed to thicken as Miranda forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Miss Carter," Miranda began, her voice softer than anyone on the flight had heard it before. I wanted to personally apologize for any inconvenience you may have experienced earlier. It was a misunderstanding on my part. Ava tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp but composed. A misunderstanding, she repeated, her voice quiet but firm. Miranda's forced smile faltered. Yes, I didn't mean to disrupt your experience. Please accept this as a token of apology. She placed the glass of sparkling water on Ava's tray table with a slightly shaky hand. Ava regarded the glass for a moment before looking back at Miranda. Thank you, she said simply, her tone neutral. But I think it's going to take more than a drink to fix this. The words, though spoken softly, hit Miranda like a slap. She swallowed hard, her palms beginning to sweat. Of course, Miranda stammered. If there's anything else I can do to make this right, please let me know. Ava didn't respond immediately. Instead, she leaned back in her seat, studying Miranda as if weighing her next move. The silence stretched just long enough to make Miranda fidget uncomfortably. Finally, Ava smiled faintly, not one of satisfaction, but one of calm confidence. I appreciate your effort, Ava said finally, but I believe the airline will address this matter appropriately after we land. Miranda's stomach sank. The mention of the airline was a clear signal that Ava wasn't letting the incident go. I understand, Miranda murmured, lowering her eyes. If you need anything else, don't hesitate to ask. Without waiting for a reply, Miranda turned and walked back to the galley as quickly as she could without running. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, and her mind raced with the implications of Ava's words. It was clear that the situation was far from resolved, and whatever was coming next was entirely out of her control. Ava, meanwhile, picked up the glass of sparkling water and took a small sip. She set it down carefully, her expression betraying nothing to the passengers around her. She appeared as calm and composed as ever, but inside, Ava knew the game was shifting entirely in her favor. Back in the galley, Dennis raised an eyebrow as Miranda slumped against the counter, her face pale. How did it go? He asked. Miranda shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. She's not done. She's going to take this all the way. Dennis sighed, his expression grim. I told you people like her? They don't play games. You should have known better. Miranda didn't respond. Instead, she stared at the curtains separating the galley from the main cabin. Miranda's thoughts spun, and for the first time, she realized Ava Carter wasn't just another passenger. She wielded far more power than Miranda had ever imagined. Now Miranda was paying the price for underestimating her. Miranda stayed in the galley, replaying the events of the flight in her mind. She had never felt so small, so exposed. Dennis moved quietly around her, occasionally glancing her way, but he said nothing. It was clear he understood the gravity of the situation, and Miranda was out of her depth. In the main cabin, Ava closed her notebook, slipping it back into her bag with deliberate care. She adjusted her posture, sitting tall, her every move precise. Despite the whispered conversations around her, Ava remained focused, unshaken. The intercom chimed again, this time with the captain's voice, laced with authority. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your trays are in their upright positions. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. As the plane began its descent, passengers shuffled around, securing their belongings. Clara, the earlier flight attendant, returned to Ava's row, offering a warm smile. But Ava's calm tone was reassuring, and Clara seemed less concerned. Meanwhile, Miranda's movements were stiff, mechanical, as she rushed through the final checks. Anxiety clouded her thoughts, and the captain's directive and Ava's words replayed in her head. Dennis and the other flight attendants watched silently as the plane descended, and Miranda's unease grew with every passing second. Ava glanced out the window, her fingers lightly resting on the armrest. She was poised, calm, as if in full control, watching the city come into view. She had anticipated every step of the journey, and now she was ready for what came next. When the plane landed, a collective sigh of relief filled the cabin. Passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts and retrieving their belongings. But Miranda's mind was far from the usual post-flight activity. She waited, aware of Ava's approach. Ava, however, didn't rush, waiting until the aisle cleared before standing and gathering her things with the same calm precision. When she finally reached the exit, Miranda straightened, her voice faltering as she forced a smile. "Thank you for flying with us, Miss Carter," she said, her tone soft. Ava paused, her eyes sharp. "I'm sure we'll be in touch," she replied smoothly. The weight of her words sent a chill through Miranda as she stepped off the plane. Miranda stood frozen, staring at the open door, expecting someone to appear. She wasn't wrong. Moments later, 2 uniformed security officers stepped onto the plane, their presence commanding immediate attention. "Are you Miranda Scott?" one of them asked. Miranda's breath caught. "Yes," she whispered. "We need you to come with us," the officer said firmly. "We have some questions regarding an incident on this flight." The color drained from Miranda's face as the weight of her actions finally hit her. Dennis stood silently, watching as she was escorted off the plane. The remaining crew exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what would happen next. Outside in the terminal, Ava stood by the gate, her phone in hand. She watched calmly as Miranda was led away, her expression unreadable. The message she had sent had done its job. Ava turned, walking toward the baggage claim, each step purposeful, confident. She didn't need to look back. The situation was exactly where she wanted it to be. Miranda, meanwhile, sat in a stark, small room at the security holding area. The officers stood near the door, their expression stern. Miranda's mind raced, trying to piece together how everything had unraveled so quickly. One of the officers spoke, breaking the silence. "Miss Scott, we've been informed of an incident involving a first-class passenger on your flight. The airline's executive team has requested a full account of your actions." Miranda swallowed hard. I don't know what this is about. I was just doing my job." The officer raised an eyebrow. "According to reports, the passenger you removed from first class was Ava Carter. Are you aware of her position?" Miranda's heart sank. I didn't know at first," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I only found out during the flight." The officer leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Miss Carter is not only a high-ranking executive affiliated with this airline, but also a major shareholder. Her complaint has already reached the board, and they take allegations of bias and mistreatment very seriously." Miranda's face turned ashen. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The officer continued, his tone growing firmer. "We've received her account, and additional passengers have corroborated her version of the story. You have the opportunity to provide your side, but let me be clear. This will not be taken lightly." Miranda's hands trembled as she gripped the table, wanting to defend herself, to explain her actions. But the words felt hollow, even before they formed. Deep down, she knew she couldn't justify what she'd done. Meanwhile, at baggage claim, Ava stood by the carousel, phone pressed to her ear. Her voice remained calm but final. "Yes, the security team has taken her in for questioning. Make sure the board reviews the footage and statements. I want this resolved professionally, but thoroughly." She listened for a moment, nodding. "Thank you. And please send a copy of the final report to my office. I want to ensure this never happens again, not to me, not to anyone." After ending the call, Ava turned her attention to the baggage carousel, effortlessly pulling her sleek black suitcase from the belt. Passengers who had shared the flight watched her, curiosity in their eyes. But Ava didn't acknowledge them, her focus entirely on her next steps. The terminal buzzed with activity, but Ava moved through it with purpose, calmness radiating from her. She had turned an incident of prejudice into an opportunity for accountability, and now she was ready for the next move. Back at the security holding area, Miranda sat, her mind a storm. The officers who had escorted her remained silent, but the weight of the situation pressed down on her. She had gone from a respected flight attendant to the subject of an investigation in the span of moments. The realization hit hard. This was no accident. It was a calculated move. One of the officers spoke again, his voice stern. "Miss Scott, we need your full account of what happened on this flight. The airline's executive team is awaiting your statement." Miranda's eyes drifted to the door, knowing the consequences of her actions had only just begun. In the sterile room, Miranda's breathing was shallow as the weight of her actions pressed down on her. The officers gave her a moment to collect herself, but the silence felt suffocating. Each passing second made it harder to steady her nerves. Finally, her voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Her eyes darted nervously between the officers. "I was just following protocol." I thought she didn't belong in first class." The officer closest to her leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "And what exactly made you think that?" Miranda hesitated, as if struggling to find an answer. The truth, that her assumption had been based on unconscious bias, was something she couldn't admit out loud. I don't know," she stammered. "She didn't act like the other passengers in first class." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, then responded, "Not acting like the other passengers isn't a justification for moving someone to a different section, especially when their ticket was valid. Did she break any rules? Did she violate any airline policies?" Miranda shook her head, her palms sweating. "No," she murmured. The officer cut her off. "Then you acted without cause. Miss Carter was within her rights to remain in the seat she paid for. And your actions have put the airline in a very difficult position." Miranda's heart sank as the gravity of his words settled in. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the facts were undeniable. Her decision had been based on an assumption, and now she was facing the consequences. Meanwhile, Ava had exited the terminal and was now waiting by the curb as a sleek black sedan pulled up. The driver, dressed in a sharp suit, stepped out and opened the door for her. "Miss Carter," he greeted with a respectful nod. "Everything has been arranged as per your instructions." "Thank you, William," Ava replied, sliding into the back seat with her usual grace. Once inside, she retrieved her phone and began scrolling through her emails. A notification from the airline's board caught her attention, and she opened it immediately. It was a concise but clear message outlining the steps the board would take to address the incident, including a formal review of the airline's training policies and an assurance that Miranda's actions would not go unchecked. Ava allowed a faint smile of satisfaction to curl at her lips. She had no interest in revenge. Her goal was accountability and change, and it seemed she was already making progress. Back at the airport, the officers had finished their questioning of Miranda. As they prepared to leave the room, one of them delivered a final, cutting statement. "This matter will be escalated to the airline's disciplinary committee. You'll receive notification of their decision soon. In the meantime, you're suspended from duty." Miranda felt her stomach drop as the officers exited, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The reality of her situation was sinking in. For the first time, she realized how completely she had underestimated Ava Carter. At that very moment, Ava's car pulled smoothly away from the terminal and blended into the stream of traffic. She gazed out the window, her mind calm and clear. The day had been exhausting, but Ava felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had stood her ground, and in doing so, had paved the way for change. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was another message from the airline's board, confirming that a full review of the incident would be conducted and that new sensitivity training for staff would be implemented. "Good," Ava responded, typing quickly. "Let's ensure this never happens again." As the city skyline came into view, Ava leaned back in her seat and let out a quiet breath. This chapter was coming to a close, but she knew her actions today would have a lasting impact on the airline, and hopefully on everyone who worked there. Miranda sat alone in the small room long after the officers had left, staring blankly at the table. The weight of her suspension, the looming investigation, and the sharp realization of what her actions had caused pressed down on her like a crushing weight. She replayed every decision she had made that day, each one unraveling her confidence further. What had seemed like an instinctual judgment earlier now felt like an irreversible mistake. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her spiraling thoughts. Hesitant, she picked it up, knowing that whatever awaited her on the screen wouldn't be good. It was a message from the airline's Human Resources Department, curt and formal. "Miranda, please be prepared to attend a disciplinary hearing scheduled for tomorrow at 9 a.m. Further details will be provided by email." Her hand trembled as she read the message. The finality of her actions became clear. The hearing wasn't just a formality. It was a chance for the airline to protect its reputation, and Miranda knew she was being positioned as the scapegoat. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but deep down, she knew there was nothing she could say to undo the damage. Meanwhile, Ava had arrived at her office, a sleek building in the heart of the city. She stepped out of the car gracefully, the driver holding the door open for her. Inside, Maya greeted her with a smile and handed her a stack of documents. "It's all here," Maya said, handing over a folder. The board's initial review of the incident, statements from the crew, and the plan for changes to training programs. They've moved quickly, Ava noted as she flipped through the documents. They know this can't be swept under the rug, Ava continued calmly. They're protecting their interests, but it's a step in the right direction. Maya hesitated before asking, "Do you think she'll fight back?" "The flight attendant, I mean." Ava paused. "Maybe," she replied finally, closing the folder. "But this isn't about her anymore. This is about the system that allowed someone like her to feel comfortable making decisions based on prejudice. That's what needs to change." Maya nodded, her admiration for Ava evident. "You've already made an impact. The board is taking this seriously because of you?" Ava gave a small smile but said nothing. She knew the work wasn't done yet. Change on a systemic level required persistence and patience, and Ava had both in abundance. Back at the airport, Miranda finally stood, her legs shaky, as she left the holding room. She avoided eye contact with the officers and airport staff as she made her way to the employee exit. The journey to her car felt like a walk of shame, her uniform a stark reminder of the career that now hung by a thread. Sitting in her car, Miranda stared at the steering wheel, her mind racing. She had spent years building her reputation as a capable and dedicated flight attendant, and now it was all unraveling. She thought about Ava, calm, composed, and untouchable. The realization struck Miranda like a blow. Ava had never lost control of the situation. She had been in charge from the moment Miranda made her first mistake. For the first time, Miranda allowed herself to feel something other than anger or frustration. A deep, gnawing regret settled in her chest. She had underestimated Ava Carter, not just as a passenger, but as a person. And now, she was paying the price. As Miranda drove away from the airport, Ava sat in her office, reviewing the documents Maya had given her. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from the airline's CEO, Richard Hale, requesting a personal meeting to discuss the incident and next steps. Ava typed a short reply, "I'll make time tomorrow. Let's ensure this is resolved properly." She set her phone down and leaned back in her chair. Her mind already moved to the future. The events of the day had been draining, but Ava knew they had also opened a door, an opportunity to reshape the culture of an entire organization. And for Ava, that was a fight worth having. The morning sun spilled through the blinds in Ava's office as she prepared for her meeting with Richard Hale, the CEO of the airline. She had spent the night reviewing documents, drafting statements, and considering the broader implications of the incident. For Ava, this wasn't just about addressing her personal experience. It was about setting a precedent that no one, regardless of their position or background, should face the kind of treatment she endured. At exactly 10 a.m., her assistant Maya escorted Richard Hale into the room. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s with silver-streaked hair and a polished demeanor. Despite his confident exterior, there was a noticeable tension in his movements as he extended his hand to Ava. "Miss Carter, thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice," Richard began, his tone carefully measured. Ava shook his hand, her expression calm but firm. "I appreciate you taking the situation seriously, Mr. Hale. Please have a seat." Richard sat across from her, adjusting his tie as he began to speak. "First, let me express my deepest apologies for what happened on your flight. It was completely unacceptable, and we are committed to ensuring that such incidents do not occur again." Ava nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I'm glad to hear that. However, apologies alone won't fix the underlying issues. This isn't just about one flight attendant making a poor decision. It's about the environment that allowed her to feel justified in that decision." Richard's face tightened slightly, but he nodded in agreement. "You're absolutely right. That's why we've already begun a full review of our policies and training programs. We're implementing mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all staff, and we'll be revisiting our internal reporting processes to ensure better accountability." Ava leaned back in her chair, studying him for a moment. "It's a start," she said, "but it's not enough. I want a detailed timeline for these changes, as well as regular updates on their progress. And I expect to see measurable results." Richard hesitated briefly before nodding. "Of course, we'll provide you with everything you need." Ava allowed a small smile to cross her lips. "Good. Let's make sure this becomes a turning point for your organization, not just a one-time correction." The meeting continued for another hour, with Ava laying out her expectations and Richard taking careful notes. By the time it ended, there was a clear sense of purpose in the room. As Richard stood to leave, he extended his hand again. This time, there was genuine respect in his gaze. "Thank you for holding us accountable," he said. "We'll make this right." Ava shook his hand firmly. "I'll hold you to that." As Richard left, Maya entered the room, her eyes bright with curiosity. "How did it go?" Ava exhaled a mix of relief and determination in her voice. "It went well, but this is just the beginning." While Ava's meeting was progressing, Miranda sat in a sterile conference room at the airline's headquarters, waiting for her disciplinary hearing to begin. The weight of her suspension hung over her like a dark cloud, and the silence of the room only amplified her growing anxiety. A stack of papers sat in front of her, each one detailing her actions during the flight and the subsequent complaints filed by Ava Carter. The door opened, and a panel of 3 senior airline executives entered, their expressions neutral but firm. One of them, a woman with sharp features and an air of authority, spoke first. "Miss Scott, thank you for coming. We're here to discuss the incident that occurred on Flight 287 and the allegations made against you." Miranda nodded weakly, her throat dry. "I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The executives began reciting the timeline of events, asking Miranda to provide her account of what happened. She tried to explain her actions, but her words felt hollow, even to her own ears. "I thought she might have been in the wrong seat," Miranda said at one point, her voice faltering. "I was just trying to follow protocol." The sharp-featured executive raised an eyebrow. "Protocol? According to our records, Miss Carter presented a valid first-class ticket. At what point did you verify this before asking her to move?" Miranda hesitated, her palms damp. I didn't," she admitted finally. The room fell silent, the weight of her admission hanging in the air. Another executive, a middle-aged man with glasses, leaned forward. "Miss Scott, the airline has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. Your actions not only violated that policy, but also jeopardized our reputation. Do you understand the severity of this situation?" Miranda nodded slowly, her heart sinking. "I do." The panel continued questioning her, their tone professional but unyielding. By the time the hearing ended, Miranda felt utterly defeated. The final decision would be communicated to her in writing, but the outcome was already clear in her mind. Her career with the airline was over. As Miranda left the room, she couldn't help but think of Ava, the composed woman who had maintained her dignity, even as Miranda stripped it away. For the first time, Miranda felt the full weight of her actions, not just their impact on her career, but on the person she had wronged. And as much as she wanted to blame the system or her instincts, she knew the truth. She had made a choice, and now she was facing the consequences. Later that afternoon, Ava sat in her office, sipping a cup of tea as she reviewed an email from the airline's board. The tone of the email was clear. They were eager to demonstrate their commitment to reform. Attached was a timeline of the planned changes Ava had requested, including the rollout of mandatory training programs and revisions to their complaint handling processes. It was a small but significant victory, and Ava allowed herself a moment to feel satisfaction. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away from the screen. It was a message from Maya. "Miranda Scott has been officially terminated. Thought you'd want to know." Ava set her cup down slowly, staring at the message. It didn't bring her joy, nor did it feel like a true resolution. Ava wasn't vindictive by nature, and she knew Miranda's dismissal was only a symptom of the larger problem. Yet it was a necessary step, an acknowledgement that actions had consequences. She leaned back in her chair, reflecting on the whirlwind of events over the past 24 hours. Her decision to act decisively had been driven by more than just personal affront. It was about setting an example, not just for the airline, but for anyone who might find themselves in her position. Ava picked up her phone and typed a quick reply to Maya. "Thanks for letting me know. Let's keep focusing on the bigger picture." Miranda sat in her small apartment that evening, the termination notice from the airline resting on the table in front of her. She had spent hours replaying the hearing in her mind, hoping to find some justification for her actions, but there was none. The reality was stark and unavoidable. Her assumptions, rooted in prejudice, had cost her everything. Her friends and family had started to reach out, their messages filled with a mix of sympathy and judgment. Miranda couldn't bring herself to respond. She felt isolated, trapped by the weight of her mistakes. She turned on the television, hoping to distract herself, but the first thing she saw was a news segment about bias in the workplace. It was as though the universe was determined to make her confront her actions. The segment featured a brief interview with Ava Carter, who spoke eloquently about the importance of systemic change and holding organizations accountable. Miranda stared at the screen, her chest tightening. Ava's calm demeanor and articulate words stood in stark contrast to Miranda's own turmoil. For the first time, she saw Ava not as an adversary, but as someone who had every right to demand better for herself and for others. Turning off the TV, Miranda sat in silence. She knew she couldn't undo what she had done, but maybe, just maybe, she could learn from it. She reached for her laptop and began typing an email. It was addressed to the airline's board, but her focus wasn't on defending herself. Instead, she wrote a heartfelt apology, not just to Ava, but to everyone her actions had affected. For the first time in days, Miranda felt a sliver of clarity. She couldn't change the past, but she could choose how she moved forward. The following week, Ava received an unexpected email. It was forwarded to her by the airline's board, with the subject line apology from former staff. Curious, she opened it and began to read. The message was from Miranda Scott, and it started with a simple acknowledgement of her mistakes. Miss Carter, I owe you an apology. My actions on that flight were inexcusable. I acted on assumptions rather than facts, and I failed to see you for who you are, a valued passenger and, more importantly, a person who deserved respect. My behavior reflected poorly not only on me but on the airline as a whole. For that, I am truly sorry. Ava read the email carefully, noting the tone of sincerity. Miranda went on to explain how the aftermath of the incident had forced her to reflect deeply on her actions and their consequences. She admitted to her biases and expressed her intention to educate herself and become a better person. This experience has been humbling, and I've come to understand that the changes you are advocating for are desperately needed, not just in this airline but everywhere. I hope my actions, though wrong, can serve as an example of what must change. I am committed to learning and to never repeating such a mistake. Thank you for holding me accountable. Ava leaned back in her chair after finishing the email, her thoughts swirling. She wasn't naive. She knew people often apologize to lessen the weight of their guilt or to salvage their reputation. But something about Miranda's words felt genuine, and Ava couldn't ignore that. She debated for a moment before drafting a brief response. Thank you for your message. Accountability is the first step toward growth. I hope you continue on this path and use this experience to create positive change in the future. Hitting send, Ava closed her laptop and gazed out the window. For her, the incident wasn't just about personal justice. It was about creating a ripple effect. And while Miranda's apology didn't erase what had happened, it hinted at the possibility of change. It was a small step, but Ava knew that even small steps could lead to something greater. Weeks passed, and the ripple effects of the incident on Flight 287 began to take hold. The airline had rolled out its first series of mandatory sensitivity and bias training sessions for all staff, a move that was announced publicly alongside a statement of accountability. Ava's role in pushing for these changes was highlighted subtly but respectfully in the announcement, positioning her not as an antagonist, but as a catalyst for progress. The changes sparked conversations across the aviation industry. Other airlines began reviewing their policies, and several reached out to Ava directly for guidance. She declined most offers, focusing instead on ensuring that her efforts with this airline were fully realized. Her work wasn't about personal accolades. It was about creating lasting impact. One afternoon, Ava found herself back at the airport, preparing for another business trip. As she approached the gate, she immediately noticed a shift in the atmosphere, something subtle but noticeable. The staff smiles were genuine, and every question was answered with patience and care. It wasn't perfect, no system ever is, but it was better, and that was a start. When Ava reached the gate, the agent immediately recognized her. Miss Carter, welcome back. We've upgraded your seat as a token of appreciation for your continued support, they said warmly. Ava smiled and appreciated the gesture, but politely waved it off. That's kind of you, but I'm fine where I am, she replied. Her humility combined with her quiet confidence commanded respect without ever demanding it. As she boarded the plane, Ava noticed the subtle changes in the crew's behavior. They were more attentive, more engaged with passengers. She took her seat, quietly observing the flow of the cabin as everyone settled in. Across the aisle, a young woman struggled to find space for her bag in the overhead compartment. Almost instinctively, a flight attendant stepped in to help her, offering a warm, reassuring tone. The scene reminded Ava of Clara, the one flight attendant during her ordeal who had shown her kindness. Ava had made sure to highlight Clara's professionalism in her discussions with the airline's board. Since then, Clara had been promoted to a senior role. Ava spotted her near the front of the cabin, supervising the boarding process with a steady, confident demeanor. Clara caught Ava's eye and smiled, a look of gratitude passing between them. Ava nodded back subtly, an unspoken acknowledgement of mutual respect. Moments like these reminded Ava why she had pushed so hard for change. Small gestures, repeated over time, could transform an entire culture. As the plane took off, Ava leaned back in her seat, reflecting on the journey, both the physical flight and everything that had followed. She thought about Miranda's apology, the systemic reforms, and the messages of support she'd received from strangers who had heard her story. It was both humbling and empowering. Meanwhile, somewhere in another part of the city, Miranda was also embarking on her own journey. She had accepted a job at a non-profit organization dedicated to workplace diversity and inclusion, using her own experience as a case study for change. It wasn't an easy path, and Miranda knew she had much to prove, but it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. For the first time, she was looking beyond herself, determined to contribute to something larger. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, Ava pulled out her notebook, flipping to a blank page. She wrote down a single line: "Change begins with accountability, but it thrives on persistence." Closing the notebook, she allowed herself a rare moment of peace, gazing out the window at the endless expanse of clouds. She knew the fight wasn't over. There was still so much work to be done, but as she watched the sky stretch before her, Ava felt something she hadn't expected: hope. The events of that flight had been painful, but they had sparked something much bigger than her. And in that moment, Ava knew with quiet certainty that the sky wasn't the limit. It was just the beginning. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.